All right, thank you, Renee. Good evening. I'm Mark Kistler, and I'll be your host this evening at Narrative Medicine Rounds. On behalf of the Division of Narrative Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, I welcome those of you who are joining Rounds for the first time and welcome back all returning attendees. Narrative medicine arose at Columbia in 2001 and is now an international movement at the intersection of humanities, the arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice. Narrative training equips clinicians to humbly try to comprehend their patients' experiences and perspectives so as to deliver equitable and effective healthcare. Rigorous training and practice of narrative medicine helps all those interested in person-centered, respectful healthcare to deepen their self-awareness, clinical attunement, collaborative skills, and creative capacities. Our commitments to healthcare justice underlie our writing, teaching, research, advocacy, and delivery of care. The narrative medicine community assembles monthly at Rounds to grow our knowledge, partnership, and commitment to a just and effective healthcare future. Before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I've been asked to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules to ensure the program goes smoothly. Please keep your microphone muted to cut down on background noise during the program. Be forewarned that if there's any disruptions or inappropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. During the talk, we ask people to keep chat interactions to a minimum. As we get closer to the Q&A part of the event, we will invite you to submit questions via chat for our speaker. But before then, we won't be monitoring questions, so please save your questions to type into the chat after we make the announcement. This event's being recorded. Everyone who registered will receive a link a few days following the event, and you can share it as you wish. Captioning will be available during tonight's event. And at the end, we'll have a link to the online bookstores to order books or find more information about our speaker and about the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics in the program in narrative medicine. So let's get started. Ricardo Nuila is a writer and associate professor of medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. For the past 13 years, he has worked as a hospitalist and attending at Houston's largest safety net facility, Ben Taub Hospital. Ricardo's essays and articles on health disparities have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Texas Monthly, The Atlantic, The New England Journal of Medicine. Fictional works have appeared in the Best American Short Stories anthology, Guernica, and McSweeney's. He's the director of the Humanities Expression and Arts Lab at Baylor, which integrates arts and humanities into medical education, and has received an Association of American Medical Colleges grant supporting its work. His first book, The People's Hospital, Hope and Peril in American Medicine, was featured on NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. In its review, the New York Times notes that Ricardo is a skillful writer who humanizes his points in meticulous and compassionate detail through focusing primarily on the stories of 5 Ben Taub patients. And while this didn't make it into the bio, I can speak from personal experience that Ricardo is an excellent clinician, educator, and mentor. So let's welcome Ricardo.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mark. It's really an honor to be here with you. You and I were together at Baylor and we're colleagues and friends, and it feels so warm that you are the one who introduced me and that we're together today. And thank you to everybody in the community. I feel like I owe everybody a lot because when I was a young attending and I was trying to figure out how to blend medicine and creative writing, I heard about narrative medicine in Columbia and I visited a workshop. And I found that there's this incredible community in which really helped me, I think that helped me see the possibilities that come with bringing the two together. I was writing fiction at the time, but I feel like even the insight that nonfiction could become the creative means of artistically rendering what we see in our patients' lives. That was one of the experiences that helped bring that idea together in narrative medicine. And I feel like this book that I've written, it's taken me quite a long time. I feel like 6-7 years. I don't know how to count, where to start counting, but it became a love letter to the hospital where I work at, the public hospital, in Houston, Texas, Ben Taub Hospital. A reckoning or a sort of a questioning of why do I like working there? Why do I love it so much? And it became, I think, through the investigation of, an inquiry into Why don't I like American medicine outside of these walls? What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a presentation that involves reading and chopped up with some discussion that the reading engenders. What you'll be seeing also are artistic renderings of patients from Ben Taub from an artist, Danica Novgorodov, who has given permission to use these watercolors. And I think I'm just going to start from the very beginning. I'm going to share my screen right now. And I'm going to start from the very beginning of the People's Hospital, Hope and Peril, in American Medicine, from chapter 1, Histories. The rumor we heard was that patients arrived with hand-drawn maps, our hospital marked like treasure. The stately Nigerian lady who responded, "Yes, doctor," to everything, metastatic breast cancer. The boy with the black curly hair wearing red Converse All-Stars and a Judas Priest t-shirt that screamed Mexico City, acute lymphocytic leukemia. The grandmother with the sari snagged in the guardrails, chest pain, real chest pain, might need bypass. We stood at these patients' bedsides. We wrote down their histories. We said we were sorry for examining them with cold hands. We ordered blood tests, interpreted EKGs, scrolled through their CAT scans. We input diagnoses. We weren't just doctors. Among us were nurses, social workers, x-ray techs, the people who rode up and down the hallways in the middle of the night, waxing the floors. Some of us wore white coats with frayed sleeves and busted pockets, others tight-fitting scrubs embroidered with our names. In our bad moments, we became tribal. We weren't we were ortho, medicine, plastics, the 4A nurses. We only covered the unit. More often, though, the needs of our patients were so damn immediate, we found a way to work as one. We ran blood transfusions, heparin drips, a morphine pump when Norco didn't touch the pain. When COVID came, we gave oxygen together, one of us twisting the knob on the valve while the other inserted those tiny prongs into flared nostrils. We consulted one another when things looked dicey, surgery if we found boils, ID for antibiotics. And if anything looked remotely like a seizure, a twitch, a rolling of the eyes, we paged neurology overhead. If transportation was swamped, we wheeled them ourselves to MRI, to special procedures, to the cath lab, even the ICU. How downtrodden we looked when we did this, like beaten dogs. We figured out ways to make things work. Not enough money for your meds? We Googled the $4 list at Walmart. Muscles too weak? We dug up a refurbished walker from the basement. Dying and homeless and alone? We called in a favor from the hospice that used to be a Tudor-style home. And when our work was done, once we could envision someone not dying within 24 hours of our discharge order, once the first chemo had gone in, once we could be sure their chief complaint was addressed, the thought still lingered in our minds. What brought them here? What are their stories? Ben Taub Hospital, the largest safety net hospital in one of America's most diverse cities. We are Heathrow if you replace the Emirates and the Virgin Atlantic planes with Greyhound buses. There are no atriums with pianists here playing "Here Comes the Sun" to welcome you. No soothing sounds of running water from hidden speakers or, gasp, from an actual indoor waterfall. There is no Starbucks. Our cafeteria serves some form of barbecue most days for lunch and packaged salads topped with egg or chicken strips. That's unless you prefer the full menu McDonald's located inside the hospital that's open 23 hours a day. We do have a gift shop, though it looks more like a convenience store, heavily stocked with greeting cards. Not the pun-filled ones, rather the kind that get the point across. Condolences, available in Spanish too. If you type Ben Taub into Google Maps, you'll find it crammed between the Houston Zoo and the 30 other institutions that make up the Texas Medical Center, the largest concentration of medical facilities in the world. Some of the field's most important innovations took place in this medical metropolis. The first successful bypass, the first artificial heart transplant, the first beatless artificial heart. Imagine that, no lub dub, just a constant whirring. the first silicone breast implant, one of the first civilian helicopter ambulances, the Bubble Boy, all here. Not that the patients at Ben Taub know this. Some may have heard that MD Anderson is rated top in the country in cancer care, or that at Houston Methodist, you might find yourself fortunate enough to have a robot operate on your prostate. The TV ads air in Spanish too. It's possible that at night our patients look out their windows and behold the sparkle of so many new glass buildings, some of them named after billionaire sheiks who sell the oil that becomes their gas. More likely, they're looking out in the direction of the zoo, toward the parking garage and bus stop, wondering how they'll get home. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and growing up, I remember hearing about the public hospital Ben Taub on the news. It would be something like person shot, victims taken to Ben Taub Hospital, or an accident. It was a trauma hospital, so motor vehicle accidents, and you would hear about it on the news. I didn't really know what was going on in those walls, who was getting care. And as the healthcare system in America has become more corporatized, more private, and more people fall through the cracks where they can't access private care, and as societies become more inequitable in the United States, more and more people have had to use that public hospital. So I want to introduce you to one of them right now, one of the people who I met at Ben Taub and who became one of the subjects for the book. Stephen Hart was good at one thing. It was managing restaurants. For 12 years, he'd resurrected different branches of a burger chain in Houston and made them profitable. Stephen didn't have an MBA or any kind of special training. He had people skills, which, after some twists and turns in life, had bloomed for him in the service industry. The truth was that Stephen enjoyed going out of his way to help customers. He loved becoming the highlight of someone's day. That corporate talk about turning an ow into a wow sounded lame, yes, but in fact, it made him tick. He wasn't one of those general managers who buried himself in an office tracking avocado prices during the dinner rush. Rather, he preferred striking up conversations with customers the moment they stepped through the door. One night, while Stephen was taking orders at the counter, a guest mused to him about having eaten the tastiest burger there the last time he came, one with slabs of bacon and Swiss cheese topped with a thick slice of grilled pineapple. Did Stephen know the burger? That would be the Hawaiian burger, Stephen said, smoothing out the ends of his stash. His silvery voice and appearance, kempt, like a man rising from a barber's chair, helped to soften the bad news that the chain hadn't carried the burger for years. Man, the guest lamented. Most general managers would have chalked up the disappointment to part of the job. Specialty burgers came and they went. Stephen, however, was not most managers. Would you like one? He asked. That would be awesome. Stephen warned him it might take a minute since he knew this kitchen didn't stock pineapple. He picked up the keys to his truck, exited the restaurant, and drove 3 miles to the nearest grocery store where, for 89 cents, he purchased a can of the prized fruits. Not 10 minutes later, the first dribbles of nectar sizzled on the grill. Stephen made sure the char was just right before flipping the pineapple over and then crowning his concoction. As the guest bit into his Hawaiian burger, Stephen knew he'd earned a customer for life. But Stephen, like so many Americans, didn't realize that he was on very thin ice. In America, we have privatized healthcare to such an extreme where, depending on your selections for insurance plans, you might have very, very little coverage. You might not even have true access to healthcare. And so Stephen was introduced to Ben Taub in a way that I'm going to describe for you right now. The burger chain offered different grades of health insurance, from Cadillac plans to the bare bones. Ever a bargain hunter, Stephen opted for the cheapest health insurance available, which deducted only $88 from his check every other week. Like buying cheese at the right price point, this was a value-based decision. In his 55 years of living on God's green earth, he had never needed to see a doctor. Why waste the money? Then in late March 2020, as the world awakened to the fact that a pandemic was spreading to all its far corners, Stephen phoned corporate with some bad news. After shaking all night with chills, he checked his temperature. Stephen was running a fever. As the only one with keys to a restaurant trying to make do during a COVID lockdown, Stephen knew this presented a problem. He agreed to open the restaurant and return home immediately for a 2-week quarantine. This would be the last time he set foot in the restaurant as its general manager. His insurance plan only provided coverage for a teledoc visit. Via his webcam, Stephen tried to show this new doctor a lymph node below his left jaw, one that had grown in size over the past year. But Zoom made it hard. The doctor prescribed him an antibiotic, and within a couple of days, what had felt like a pea beneath his skin now felt like a baseball. Stephen was sure he didn't have COVID. He began to worry the mask was causing the fever. Aware it would cost him, Stephen decided to bite the bullet and visit the emergency room of a reputable nearby hospital. Before even sitting down in the waiting area, he paid the $639 requested, insisted upon by the hospital's clerk. This got him in the door. Next, a doctor examined him, ordered a CAT scan of his neck, and, not long afterward, relayed the results. First, that Stephen had cancer in his tonsils, and second, that an ear, nose, throat doctor, or ENT, awaited him at a different branch across town. Stephen feared what the ambulance ride might cost. "I feel okay," he said. "I can walk. Can't I just drive myself or go tomorrow?" The hospital followed a specific protocol in these situations, the ER doctor explained. Stephen walked into the ambulance and sat quietly the entire ride to the branch. Once they arrived, nobody there seemed to know anything about his situation, so Stephen waited patiently for the ENT, who was supposedly there waiting for him. Finally, after many hours, the doctor saw him. He'd seen the scans and, yes, there appeared to be cancer in his tonsils. Stephen expected more after this, for the ENT to say, "and so," or "based on this," or to dive into some plan of action. This was cancer after all. But the operative word was, however. "However, you don't have insurance," he said. He meant sufficient insurance. It is a fiction in America that the thin plastic card bearing our name and plan is our panacea. Politicians and journalists pretend it's a tidy little equation. If you're insured, you're okay. The truth is much more complicated. Even though Stephen had insurance, it covered so little that he had to prepay the ER for a cancer diagnosis. He could live with being on the wrong end of a bad deal, for now anyway. What he couldn't quite digest was how the people in the ER had treated him. He felt shitty. It seemed wrong that they'd sent him here and there and then kicked him to the curb. He could understand that nothing would take the cancer away today and that his life wasn't immediately in danger. But how could anyone be so callous? Who says however in a situation like this? After the ENT departed, a social worker entered his ER room and gave Stephen some quick and simple advice. "Go to the public hospital," she said. "Go to Ben Taub." Stephen patted the tiny handlebar ends of his mustache. His fingers drifted to the left side of his neck, which felt hard and unshaven. In his mind, these two words, public and hospital, never belonged together. Wasn't this America? He'd never spent a night in a hospital, and now he would have to step foot in a place he recognized from the 10 o'clock news, where gunshot victims recuperated and Houston's homeless took shelter. He imagined drug addicts lining the halls, the dregs of society. This is going to be hell, he thought. I have hit bottom. So that's Stephen's introduction to the healthcare system. Really hasn't had to use it. He learns about his cancer diagnosis and is told you don't have sufficient insurance to really get treatment here. And somebody tells him whispers to him really in his ER room, go to the public hospital, go to Ben Taub, which is, for those of us who have worked there, such a common story. Now, that introduction to healthcare is very different than my own introduction to healthcare. I am the son of a doctor in Houston, private practice doctor, a private practice OB-GYN. I went to the hospital with my father growing up and remember being in those lounges and feeling like it was glorious. He worked at a private hospital in Wichita, Kansas, and then in Houston, Texas. And from really, in this time, the 80s, 90s, healthcare in America, the history of healthcare in America is that it's starting to privatize more and more. It's starting to become less and less possibility. People are starting to fall through the cracks more and more because they don't fit into the system of private health insurance. My dad really loved medicine. It was his identity. He wore scrubs to the OR and with pride, and suits on clinic days with pride. He treasured medicine at that time, but by the time that I was applying for medical school, he had been so beaten down by the insurance, what it took to get reimbursement from insurances, that I was very, very, I didn't want to go into medicine. I thought it was too transactional. He felt that medicine was precious the way that Stephen felt managing restaurants was precious. But what I learned, one of the things that came together for me was what I found precious was writing. I really loved writing. And it wasn't until I got to Ben Taub Hospital as a medical student where it all started to come together, where I felt that it doesn't have to be transactional. It could be more about people. It could be also about putting words together to these stories. The tension between what is public and what is private is fundamental to the hospital. We arrive at our weakest and most vulnerable. We present ourselves before authority figures clad in scrubs and give our arm for a vital sign check, our tongue to see if we have a fever, our insurance card, if we're lucky enough to have one. We give our words, the histories of our health, our rendition of the events that brought us there. And then we wait. We wait among others. We absorb things from these strangers, not their contagion, but their body's instrumentation of it. We hear wheezes, dry heaves, muffled sobs. We see yellow skin and black bruises and the spectacle of human organs in conflict with themselves. We smell the dehydration of others, the sweet ketones in their breath, their sweat and bile. And still we wait. From now until we are discharged, we are the hospital's wards. When finally it's our turn, we find ourselves led to a stretcher cordoned off by a sliding glass door, a wraparound curtain, perhaps even drywall and a door. We think we're better off like this. We believe this privacy constitutes more personal care, and we certainly pay more for it. But are we really better off? We are no longer with so many strangers, but we are no longer in view of the nurses and doctors either. How much privacy is appropriate in hospitals? Over the last 100 years, the architecture of emergency rooms and medical wards has changed to make care more private. Originally, 100% of hospital beds were laid out in large wards where patients lay side by side. But by 1910, that number had dwindled to 28%. As the care of the wealthy migrated from their homes to private rooms and hospitals, the large communal wards began to disappear. That was one of the things that I had to reckon with when I was initially at the public hospital, Ben Taub, that it looked different than the private hospitals where I'd visited with my father, or that I had maybe shadowed doctors in preparation for medical school. It's not this, it didn't look the same. There was these large wards, and you know, it dawned upon me later that a lot of people feel that the work that's being done there must not be good work because it's a public hospital. sometime during my residency, I went, there was a lecture on the cost of healthcare in America and how disproportionate it is compared to other countries, disproportionately high. And it was comparing outcomes and cost. And I went to the lecture, I raised my hand and said, well, what about the cost of healthcare at the county system, at the public system with the outcomes? And the lecturer, who was a renowned economist, still is, and studies healthcare systems, says there's no studies about public healthcare in America. And it really dawned on me then that this was just, we have swung so far private in the United States that we don't even examine the idea of what public healthcare could look like in the United States. I was seeing it firsthand at Ben Taub Hospital. I had seen patients firsthand get care there that they wouldn't have gotten elsewhere. And it seemed like the outcomes were generally good, even though there were many, many impediments. There was a long waiting list. There were so many, there were other problems too, when you would compare it to private systems. And so that became a lot of the genesis of this book, is really an interrogation into this idea. Can public healthcare, what does public healthcare do for us, and how does it help? And I want to share with you one of the ways that I've seen that it helps some patients. For many who've experienced only the labyrinthine layouts of modern ERs with their individual rooms or 6 patient bays, coming into one of these wards can be a bit shocking. It's a little like walking the streets of Manhattan for the first time when all you've experienced is smaller cities. It's not just the density of people you feel, but their purpose. Everyone on task trying to survive. Open wards give doctors and nurses constant contact with patients. They allow the staff to survey a patient's behavior before deciding whether that person should stay in the hospital or go home. They are also economical to construct, which is one of the reasons they're still part of the architecture of many safety net hospitals. I must acknowledge that my position on the open ward was a privileged one. This is true of all caretakers. Ben Taub's open ward allowed me to stand back and observe all my patients' activities as if they were a TV show. I had only a small protected role to play in the drama that unfolded in the Nightingale Ward. If I were the one lying on the stretcher, connected to electrodes, waiting for CAT scan results, I have no clue how I'd handle myself amid the shouting and the retching and the flashes of nudity. On one hand, I suspect I'd want to make sure the medical staff had the best chance of assessing me. In that case, I might wait patiently in an open ward. On the other, I would probably want privacy if my illness made me feel vulnerable. Some of my patients have told me that their time waiting in the Nightingale Ward changed their lives. God wanted me to see it, one patient said to me. She described herself as middle class and lived in a wealthy suburb named Sugarland. She'd never thought she'd come to Ben Taub, as she'd had health insurance most of her life. But a divorce left her uncovered, and that was exactly when she got sick. All of her friends told her to come to Ben Taub. She waited in the ER for many hours, desperate to figure out why she was losing weight and feeling tired. As she waited, the drama of other lives unfolded in front of her. She saw prisoners and people in the throes of psychoses, all from different social classes, trying to cope with their own problems. And she found it transformative. Seeing that pushed me out of my bubble, she said. Bubble, I thought when she said this. The word reminded me of a quote from philosopher John Stuart Mill. One of the effects of civilization, not to say one of the ingredients of it, is that the spectacle and even the very idea of pain is more and more kept out of the sight of those classes who enjoy in their fullness the benefits of civilization. Patients tell me they commiserate in the Nightingale Ward, that they build solidarity. Sometimes the best kind of healing happens there. Another patient told me she never wanted to wait the way she did in the holding area again. The only saving moment, she told me, was her conversation with the man next to her. He was recovering from a crack binge. He was sobbing at the state of everything, how his life was in ruins. The woman was a recovering crack addict and had been totally drug-free for going on 10 years. She told me she sang a hymn with the man, tongue lashed him a bit. "You the only one that can stop." Told him exactly what she'd done to quit and prayed with him. Without a doubt, none of us working at Ben Taub that day had been as helpful to the man as she had been. This book brings the stories of 5 patients who cannot find health care in Houston, Texas, and must go to the public healthcare system, and tracks their lives through the healthcare system, along with the history of how it came to be in America that private health insurance is the point of entry for access of care, how hospitals became for-profit versus nonprofit, and how physicians came to incorporate fee-for-service into their mode of billing in America. And it's an argument as much as a story about these 5 people going through the public healthcare system. I want to end with a reading from one of the inspirations behind this book, which was the physician Anton Chekhov, who was a writer, but was also much more than that, was also somebody who devoted himself to this question of how best to provide healthcare for his fellow citizens. He was in Russia, but it's a universal question. What is the best way that we should be able to care for our community, provide healthcare for everybody? And I'm gonna read from this and then conclude. "There ought to be a man with a hammer behind the door of every happy man," Anton Chekhov wrote, "to remind him by his constant knocks that there are unhappy people." Many people know Chekhov worked as a doctor, even as he wrote his short stories and plays in 19th century Russia, but his devotion to the poor is not as well recognized. Chekhov traveled via horse-drawn carriage from Moscow, which sits on Israel's longitude, 3 months through the Russian tundra, nearly 4,000 miles to Sakhalin Island, just north of Japan. He did this to write about the deplorable conditions of a penal colony on Sakhalin, as well as the public health failures. More than anything, however, Chekhov wrote about the people living in these desperate conditions. As famous as he was, Chekhov could have worked as a concierge doctor and catered to Moscow's elite. Instead, he wrote stories about the poor so that the fortunate might understand that their plight is everyone's responsibility. Apparently, a happy man only feels so because the unhappy bear their burden in silence. Chekhov eventually died of tuberculosis, an illness he contracted from the patients he served. He had been born poor. His patients were poor. He had traveled to the poorest part of Russia. He saw in his practice how tuberculosis devastated his fellow Russians, with a mortality rate of 400 deaths per 100,000 people, 1.5 times that of COVID-19 in the United States. Chekhov also recognized how little the government of his beloved Russia cared about tuberculosis and poverty. The authorities had enacted a campaign they called the Fight Against Tuberculosis, which consisted of nothing more than epidemiological surveys. For all its pomp, the program received no funding from the state. Rather, it relied on charity. This touched a nerve with Chekhov, and 3 months after returning from Sakhalin, he wrote a letter to the vice director of the Ministry of Justice, a man who taught law, served as a judge, and, it so happened, had a soft spot for writers. "I believe it is very harmful to have to depend mainly on charity," he wrote. "I think it would be far better if this problem were to be addressed by funding from the state." Chekhov explained that the problem in Sakhalin went deeper than whatever numbers might appear on a survey. "I encountered no infectious diseases on Sakhalin and found very little congenital syphilis, but I did see children who were blind, dirty, and covered in sores, all diseases that bear witness to neglect." Years later, at the height of his popularity, Chekhov sat down in the dining room of the Hermitage restaurant, one of the most exclusive locations in all of Russia. As the meal began, blood began to stream from his mouth. The tuberculosis, which up to that point had for him been more of an annoyance than a debilitating illness, had caused his lungs to hemorrhage. He lay in bed for days recovering, first at a clinic and then in a hotel. The clinician and master of the written word received what treatments were available, including ventilated air spiked with turpentine and eucalyptus, wine from Hungary, a cognac after dinner. He wrote more letters in his convalescence, including to young authors, giving them advice. Your task is to be a sincere artist, writing only about what exists or what you think ought to exist, he wrote, painting pictures of life as it is. This book takes inspiration from the many letters Chekhov wrote as much as from his fiction. Chekhov never got to see his beloved Russia reform the way it treated its sick and poor. The scourge of tuberculosis continued until governments around the world recognized the illness as a public health threat and invested in its institutions. His devotion to the poor and to his writing had meaning. The man at the Ministry of Justice to whom Chekhov had written took his words to heart. Russia's criminal code was revised 1 year before Chekhov died, meaning that fewer people were sent to suffer on Sakhalin Island. As a patient and a doctor and a person who cared deeply about the suffering of others, he never would have chosen to have tuberculosis, but he also didn't regret contracting it, or at least he never said he did in the letters he wrote. Even at the peak of his illness, in the throes of maximum symptomatology, he blamed and reviled no one, not even the patients who transmitted the disease to him. Connecting with people, serving them, making them think and enjoy life for the length of a play or short story, or even an appointment in his clinic meant that much to him. So did pushing to change the system that ignored this suffering. Histories were Chekhov's hammer. The tapping on the door we hear in stories of injustice, his and all stories that depict the unhappy living in silence, should awaken us to find more humane ways, in this case, of providing health care. And that's what I think is one of the important essential parts of our profession for healthcare providers, is to remind all that we need to find a way to make the United States, our society, and healthcare more equitable, because it's harming our profession to see this, and people are really living through these things. So this book is an attempt to demonstrate that there's ways out of it's an attempt to show that a public healthcare system can achieve more than what our preconceptions of healthcare in America give it credit for. And I'm just going to end there, and thank you all very much for your attention and for listening.
What a great reading. Thank you so much. It's one thing to read a book and another to hear it read aloud. And I'm always struck by that and how that enlivens and opens up these other dimensions. And there's so much of your voice, Ricardo, sort of throughout this book. I feel like you don't recede behind that objectivity that we often see, the artificial objectivity, right, of the patient chart or the scientific narrative, but you also address some very broad systemic issues. So I'm interested in the genesis of this writerly voice, if you could talk to that a little bit, and also maybe in the ways that these patients who you write about with such sensitivity might have called that voice forth for you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks, Mark. I think the writerly voice it's interesting how it's merged with like the voice that I use at the bedside, because I try not to wear the identity of doctor so much at the bedside, meaning like I want to be able, I would rather people feel like I am trying to solve a problem rather than represent like science and medicine. So I'm very attentive, and I listen, but I try to cultivate my words so that they're in sync with how the conversation that I'm having, the person that I'm with. So I try to avoid jargon, all of these things that the medical humanities and communications try to do. And I feel like that the writerly voice developed in a certain way. developed similarly, which is to kind of like carve out like this nuanced voice, which is like try to express the science, try to express the medical portion of it while adhering to the emotional and pain, like to the emotional valence of every moment, so and I think like any writerly voice comes from a lot of the books that you read, and trying to what's it called, like remove the knots of like your own sort of like thoughts, so that like you can portray them a bit clearly, and in the different sometimes conflicting opinions that you have in your mind can be still kind of come out in a way that's still like in line. I hope that makes sense, but I guess it's like the writerly voice is trying to bring a lot of like conflicting thoughts together and describe something that is still something that others can understand on the other side. So.
Mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense to me. And I think the sense of the parallels is something, that often in the narrative medicine world is talked about, are these parallels between, I think it's the acts of reading and acts of healing. And in your case, these acts of writing, coalescing these ideas, drawing parallels, and being really radically present. The other thing, I loved this section on the Nightingale Ward. That's always been one of my favorite images. And I think I like the idea of this open ward because it's so visceral. It's one of the many visceral images of Ben Taub that you bring. But at the same time, I feel like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it operates on this metaphorical level also. And there's something to be said there about the care of the individual and the collective, in this paradigm that you're talking about. I'm curious, if you want to talk about that a little bit, and also the ways that your experience of the Nightingale Ward, of the Ben Taub ED, or Ben Taub in general, have changed since you wrote this book.
Yeah, great questions. I think that I've had many students who have not had many experiences in medicine, maybe in first year, maybe pre-med, who I've taken through the emergency ward, and they have that, wow, this is very different. And part of it is that I think that we've just become so accustomed to privatization. It's almost like somebody who's only been driven in a car to be on the subway, that there's this visceral, like I'm really right next to somebody. But I do feel that there's something about the experience once you start to understand like the cadence, and that there are real like experts there who are managing how like an open ward like that is running, where you say, so why did I think that this is just, why was I put off so much about this, and why did I presume that it must be worse than something private? And I think that that's what I'm sort of interested in, what our like baseline mentalities are about that, but yes, and when I started to write the book, there was a lot of things that changed about the hospitals change as much as like human beings change. Interestingly enough, I feel like, and by Ben Taub started to renovate the emergency room, so that by the time that the book was published, it started to look more like a privatized, like private hospital location. It also, like the McDonald's that I mentioned was no longer there, so I was just like, what do I do with this? But I felt like that's just the arcs of like stories, like I wanted to give people the sense that was my experience sense, that like these hospitals that you work at have like a life to their own, it feels like, and their own arcs, and to capture that, and so there was something interesting that the McDonald's was not there, and that but that the like emergency room had changed. So it did feel at times like I was trying to shoot for a moving target. And I think at one point during the writing, I was just embrace that it's always going to be a chaotic mess. And, kind of like the way that you embrace as a medical student, just like, this looks like chaos, the open ward. And like, once you embrace that, it's like, wait a minute, I can start to actually understand what's going on here. So.
Yeah, that's great. Speaking of the chaos that you experienced as a medical student, I saw in the chat here, there was a comment that came by asking, essentially, just to paraphrase, for your letters to a young medical student, or to more inclusively of, practitioner in general. Are there things that you would say, both from a health systems standpoint and maybe from the narrative practice standpoint, that you would want to impart to learners?
To learners, I think pay more attention to the patient rather than to what's going on with that dynamic with your colleagues. It just feels like so much of, I mean, I'm not trying to say ignore your colleague. What I'm saying is that so much of I think back to my experiences, and there was oftentimes it's just like you instead of like looking forward, you like look left, look right, and you see what the other people's reactions are, rather than just to like focus on what's happening, like the person in front of you, And I think that that's ultimately one of my arguments in the book is that a public system, what my felt experience is that the public system freed me in a way to think about medicine and to think about my patient in front of me, because it removed some of these barriers that are in the more privatized systems, the things about billing, decision making, things like this. That's my argument. That's one of my arguments, and I go through it in there. But I think attention is like, and you are like, you've done incredible work on this, Mark. And it's like, from the moment that I read one of your papers, I was like, this it's right on. Attention is one of the most beautiful things that you can give somebody. What was that quote that you said from Simone Weil? Like, if you don't mind, like in the workup we were talking, and this quote came up. Yeah,
right. That attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity.
I believe that. I think that's one of the nexus. That's the nexus of, for me, what was literature and clinical practice, was that attention helped as a writer, and it helped me as a clinician, which was that I could just tune in to, like, listening what a patient was saying, needed, and it helped me, my decision making. And the listening is clearly a part of writing. It's just, it helps the dialogue. It helps form, the characterization of people, all these things. So I think that's, and I feel like we're in an environment where our attention is being poached at all times. People are out there to try to rob our attention from these very human moments. So you have to be on guard. That's why that would be one of my primary things to tell somebody who's young, just be like, guard your attention with everything you got, cultivate it, and be aware that there are some forces out there trying to rob it.
Thanks. Turning again to the chat, there's some great and difficult questions about things like fee for service, about preventative care and how that's incentivized or disincentivized, about the holes that might exist within our safety net system, or even a system that relies on safety net. I'm kind of curious, I think there's a lot there to address. We're in the middle of this story, right? In many ways. Do you think, is this a story with a good ending? Is this a hopeful narrative? And what is your hope in right now for American healthcare?
Yeah, that's great. So first of all, I wanted to say that this book was certainly not written to preach to the choir of like, that there, this was intended to really address ideas on both sides of the political spectrum, to really try to think about like bringing, together what are the ideas that are on one side and on the other, that there's linkage, right? So what I mean to say by that I try to take as accurate and as strong a look under the microscope of like the problems with the safety net system as possible, you know? And so I don't think, I really hope that somebody doesn't come away saying, okay, this was just a one view that is very biased. Yes, we're all biased, but this is a real attempt to look at all sides of this and to come up with an argument for it. And there is a measure on the Houston ballot on November to increase funding for the safety net system, for the public healthcare system. $2.2 billion to rebuild one of the hospitals, to add a level 1 trauma center. Houston needs is direly in need of one, to add outlying clinics. I think that that's process, just like the way that when you're starting a manuscript and you start with one line, if you're envisioning like the end from that beginning, you might be swallowed by like the white on the page, right? But there's process. You go about the process. And I'm hopeful, because I feel like the public system can be a counterweight to the private difficulties that we have here. That's what I envision. That's what I hope for. Is that when I feel like Harris County, when people at Houston vote for this measure, if they vote for it, I think that they're not voting just to provide healthcare for, quote, poor people. I see it as they're voting to take a step in the direction of a better healthcare system, a different healthcare system, to one more step, to get out of like the lockdown that what I call Medicine Inc. or private healthcare, corporate medicine has on the American healthcare system. So that's the hope that I have, is that this can be done democratically. And I am very hopeful that this is on the ballot, and this can be on the ballot in multiple places. It requires people from the profession, doctors, nurses, to really just speak out and to put it on the map for politicians. And it requires us to really will for it to happen. But that's the only way that I see it will happen, is if it's democratically done. But that's me.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm aware we're getting close to the end of our time here. And there's many great questions in the chat. I'd encourage everyone to check out the book, The People's Hospital. You said of Chekhov, the patient history was his hammer. And I really do think we can say that safely of you in this book, and the way that you bring these patient stories, in such a beautifully rendered, respectful, and agency-filled way to all of us. So thank you for that.
That's really nice. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for joining us tonight. I know I was asked to kind of bring things to close here around 6:55. So a recording of tonight, just a reminder, recording of tonight's event will be shared in the coming days via email to all who registered. We hope to see you all next month on October 4th, when we welcome psychiatrist and author Judith L. Herman to talk about her new book, Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. Thank you, and see you then.